Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 547. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today is February 21st, 2024. We have a lot of news to talk about on today's show, including the war in Yemen. The Houthis had a couple big hits recently, and so we'll be breaking those down. Additionally, news on the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. Be sure to share the show. Is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can listen to the show anywhere you get audio podcasts. The video version is up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. No matter where you're listening to the show, make sure you're subscribed to the show. And if that platform has the feature that you also hit the alarm bell there. That way you actually get a new notification when the show comes out. Of course, we are always countering the empire narrative here at Conflicts of Interest. And because of that, we are, regularly suppressing the algorithms. And so, you had to take steps to make sure you're getting informed when there's a new episode of this show out, or you got to be going to the page every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to make sure you get it, because YouTube and a lot of these platforms, Facebook, Instagram, are just not going to put this in your feed. And then also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _. I post everything I do, including a lot of the things that we talk about on the show, all the articles that I write, the articles that Dave DeCamp writes for antiwar.com. Every episode of this show all gets posted on Nets, and I get pretty decent engagement there. So if you are, and by the way, they do have an alarm bell now on Twitter as well, so you could get notifications of when I put out a tweet. All right, everybody, let's get into it. First up today, we have to mention what's going on with Julian Assange. Now, as we speak here on the show, Julian Assange is probably in a courtroom in the UK, although my understanding was this morning his final appeal is going on. Today is, I guess, day 2 of day ads for Julian Assange, so this is a pretty significant day. And from looking at the people I follow on Twitter, Kevin Gastola, Stefania Marizzi, people like this who are very involved in keeping track of what's going on in the UK. They are either trying to get into the courtroom or they're trying to have a live stream feed and things like this. It doesn't sound like it sounds like there's a couple issues. One is an audio issue that even people who are in the courtroom cannot hear what's going on, and this has actually caused a delay in day 2 of the appeal hearing. And then it seems like, people are being put in cramped overflow rooms without tables, and it seems like a real nightmare. And you imagine that the UK knew that this was coming for a long time, and it's not that London can't figure out how to put together a large courtroom or something like that. I'm sure it would have been very easy to do, but this seems intentional to suppress the press coverage of this as much as possible. So as far as, a breakdown of what's happening in that appeals hearing, I plan to do that either on Friday's or Monday's show. My interpretation of how this is going to go, and I could be wrong, Assange supporters are mentioning that as of tonight, they could put Julian Assange on a plane and fly him back to the U.S. That's absolutely possible, and something that, I'm concerned might happen. At the same time, I don't know if Joe Biden wants to deal with this during an election year. One of the things that he promised as president was he was going to end the war on journalism. And, this is really the most significant part and the most meaningful part of Trump's war on journalism is the prosecution of Julian Assange. So this, combined with the war in Ukraine, the proxy war he has us embroiled in there, that is not going well for the Ukrainians. The war he's backing in Israel that has turned into a genocide of the Palestinian people. This is really going to hurt Joe Biden with his base, I think. And so I don't think Joe Biden wants to deal with this. So my guess is that the UK extends out for a couple months before they actually release the results of this appeal. They will reject the appeal, but then I think they allow Assange to linger in the US probably until close to the end of the year. That's just why I think. I could be completely wrong. And I don't think, we should necessarily just act like, oh, this is going to happen down the road. let's not worry about it. I don't want to go too hard on he's coming to the US in the next couple of weeks, because if that doesn't happen, people are going to, the people who aren't as involved and don't see the importance of this as we do, aren't going to stay involved and stay with us if we, make it sound like he's coming right away, and then they don't understand why it gets delayed and delayed and delayed. In fact, they might think, oh, he won the trial or something like that. So this is a huge deal, and part of the reason it's a huge deal is this story I have up here on the screen. Assange's wife lawyer warned he will die if extradited to the U.S. The wife of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is warning that her husband will die if he is extradited to the U.S. as a hearing for what will likely be his final chance at his appeal is set to begin in the London High Court on Tuesday. And so again, it was a 2-day schedule. Tuesday was day one. Wednesday was day two. My understanding is Assange was allowed to attend that hearing. There was some debate on it, and it didn't seem like the UK government wanted him to attend before. So Stella Assange, that's Julian's wife, told the BBC that the stress from the case has left her husband in a very difficult place, both mentally and physically. This case will determine if he lives or dies, essentially, she said. Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, said almost has a similar warning that he could die if extradited due to his mental condition after being held in London's Belmarsh prison for over 4 years, and 7 years he spent under asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. Because of the treatment he has suffered, he suffers a major depressive illness. He has been diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum, and medical evidence is he will be extradited to the United States. Those conditions will cause him to commit suicide, so his life is at risk, and I am not exaggerating that, Robinson said. If extradited to the U.S., Assange faces up to 175 years in prison for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing documents provided to him by a source that was Chelsea Manning, a standard journalistic practice. The conviction would have grave implications for the First Amendment and press freedom in the U.S. and around the world. Ahead of the hearing, the Australian government is stepping up pressure on the U.S. to drop the charges against Assange, who is an Australian citizen. Last week, the Australian Parliament passed an overwhelmingly in the favor of a resolution calling for Assange's freedom, a motion that was supported by the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese. Maybe. I hope this can be resolved. I hope this can be resolved amicably. I will not come up to Australia to interfere in a legal process of other countries, but it's appropriate for us to put our very strongly view to those countries need to take into account the need for this to be concluded. And so he gave a very weak statement there, and the US and UK have a lot of leverage over Australia. There's the AUKUS agreement where the US and UK are providing Australia with nuclear submarine technology in exchange for, being more involved in the anti-China alliance and its weapon sales for the US. And so my guess is that the Prime Minister is trying not to upset the US and UK too much because of all those weapon sales, and at the same time, he doesn't want, his citizen to be killed in the US or the UK for doing journalism. So let's move on here. Next up, UK nuclear missile test fails. The Financial Times reports a British nuclear missile test failed after its Trident weapon crashed into the sea near to the submarine that fired it, in yet another embarrassing flop after the UK's last trial also failed 8 years ago. The Ministry of Defense confirmed on Tuesday that an anomaly occurred during the latest firing of a Trident II ballistic missile, which took place on January 30th off the coast of Florida. So a couple things I thought were interesting was, one, this test occurred off the coast of Florida. Two, it's the second time that one of these Tridents has failed for the UK during the past two tests over the last 8 years. The headlines for these articles, some of them have been pretty funny, saying that the missile flopped and plopped into the water near the submarine. So I try to take this a little lightheartedly. The fact that nuclear weapons won't work or something like that is only a good thing. This is death and destruction of millions if these weapons are able to do their job. At the same time, this is probably going to cost us taxpayers a lot of money. The US and the UK have, I'm sure, very similar nuclear triad systems, and so if the UK is having trouble with theirs, probably indication that there might be something going on with the American one too. And I imagine that this will cause an increase in defense spending on these Trident nuclear weapons in the near future. Now, some good news. This is great. So this is from Connor Eccles at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. 70% of Americans want diplomatic settlement to war in Ukraine. So this is, Connor writes, roughly 70% of Americans want the Biden administration to push Ukraine towards the negotiated peace with Russia as soon as possible, according to a new study from a Harris poll and the Quincy Institute, which publishes Responsible Statecraft. Support for negotiations remains high when respondents were told such a move would include the compromise by all parties, with 2 out of the 3 respondents saying that the U.S. should still pursue talks despite potential downside. The survey shows 9-point jump in the late 2022 that survey results that said 50% wanted talks. So the number is going up. That's good. And maybe this is why this is actually having so much trouble getting through Congress. I've been kind of pessimistic. I kind of tend to agree with the Glenn Greenwald analysis that the military-industrial complex does not lose in Washington, D.C. The system is completely rigged in their favor, and the fact that the House would actually prevent money from going to the White House needed to keep a war going is just unheard of. And so I do think eventually that money will get passed sometime before April. At this point is, I think, probably the timeline we're looking at. However, this is deeply unpopular. This war, Americans are struggling financially. They don't want to send another $61 billion to continue this fight with Russia when the writing is on the wall. Everyone could see it. And so, and in fact, the longer this war goes on, the worse deal Ukraine is going to get. And that's been the true sense before the war started, since day 1 of the war, day 2 of the war. And this isn't trying to make a pro-Russian argument in any way. But I think Russia wanted to limit their involvement in this war as much as possible. They just wanted Ukrainian neutrality. And they were willing to agree to that with the U.S., that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO before the war. In a couple months into the war, they were willing to withdraw to the pre-war lines, to leave the Donbass as a part of Ukraine if Ukraine would agree to neutrality. And now, Russia is not going to do that, but the longer the Ukrainians keep fighting, the more and more territory Russia is going to take. And additionally, the West is sending Ukraine more and more advanced weapons. So my guess is a part of any negotiated settlement to this war, Ukraine is going to have to at least agree to caps, if not a complete ban on NATO weapons entering Ukraine. And so if the U.S. has transferred to Ukraine F-16s and long-range missiles, as the U.S. is now talking about doing, then Russia is going to, look to impose not more just severe restrictions on Ukraine, but take more Ukrainian territory as well. So the longer this war goes on, the worse the deal that Ukraine gets. Let's talk about those long-range missiles. This is from NBC News. Biden nearing decision to send long-range missiles to Ukraine. After months of requests from Ukrainian officials, the Biden administration is working towards providing Ukraine with powerful new long-range ballistic missiles, according to 2 U.S. officials. Late last year, the U.S. began to supply Ukraine with Army tactical missile systems known as ATACMS, but so far, it has provided only the older medium-range ATACMS, and to my understanding, and the last time I saw an update on this was from Forbes, about a month and a half ago, I would say, they reported that Ukraine only received 20 cluster variants of that weapon. They didn't receive a large stockpile of them, so there wasn't very many. Now, maybe more were shipped covertly, maybe more were shipped since that report came out. I can't say for sure. Given that the U.S. hasn't had money to send new weapons to Ukraine since the end of last year, it would seem unlikely they would be able to send ATACMS, and they wouldn't be able to, presumably they wouldn't be able to send these long-range missiles without that approval. Now, there are some more weapons that the U.S. will be shipping to Ukraine over the next months or years that were paid for through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which purchased weapons on behalf of Ukraine, but purchasing weapons for Ukraine from Lockheed Martin, sometimes those weapons need to be manufactured. I'm not sure how the shipping costs are going to work. My guess is the U.S. is just going to find some way to pay for those to get them into Ukraine, but they can't, Biden can't send a new type of weapon that hasn't already been paid for, given he doesn't have the funding. So the article mentions funding for arms shipments to Ukraine remains uncertain because of opposition from former President Donald Trump and his Republican allies in Congress. And I guess they could mention the 70% of the American people who are done with this and don't want it anymore. But that doesn't seem to be important to NBC News, as often is. They try to make this all about, it's just a Trump position. It's just this fringe position only believed by this one lunatic, and usually that's not the case. All right, next up here, Bulgaria delays delivery of armored vehicles to Ukraine over demand NATO cover transportation costs. This was from the Kiev Independent. The delivery of 100 Bulgarian armored personnel carriers to Ukraine has been delayed as the Bulgarian Defense Ministry asked NATO to cover the transportation cost. The news comes even though the Bulgarian defense minister said on February 2nd that the operation to deliver the vehicles had begun. Bulgaria's interior minister in 2023 concluded an agreement with the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to provide 100 older vehicles from its stats to Ukraine. The Bulgarian parliament gave its final approval on the deal in December. Almost 3 months later, there's no information on them actually arriving in Ukraine. The defense minister said the transfer has been delayed as the Bulgarian government investigates whether NATO allies could finance the transportation cost. And so the other thing I guess that Bulgaria said is this isn't as simple as, just putting gas in these things and driving them down the road. You can't do that. You had to put them on rail. And my understanding is that some of the rail that Bulgaria has doesn't necessarily accommodate the size and the weight of these personnel carriers. So I think there's some either infrastructure upgrades or some, train vehicle purchases that need to be made here. So this is going to be expensive and we'll see what happens, but it certainly feels like the wheels are really coming off the NATO car to Ukraine at this point. You have several members who are not interested in giving more aid to Ukraine. You have large percentages of the populations of multiple countries that are completely done and against this. And it's only the leadership, particularly in Washington and London, that are unbelievably committed to this conflict. And if you listen to Biden right now, he sounds unbelievably desperate to keep this war going. He says he can't understand why the Republicans would ever do such a thing as hold up this aid. Like, this is the most important thing that's ever happened in the world. But it is to his re-election chance because he built himself on being a wartime president. And if his wartime presidency equals a massive, not just loss in Ukraine, but absolute blunder, right? Baiting Ukraine into fighting a war they didn't have to fight, and then losing half of Ukrainian territory, hundreds of thousands of men, the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure, and then the West isn't gonna, they'll probably give Ukraine some aid and help Ukraine rebuild to some extent, but not to the level that Ukraine really will need. And so this will have absolutely been devastating for Ukraine. And if the aid doesn't come, people are going to start waking up to that reality right around the time of the election. And they're also going to, over the next couple of months, wake up to the reality that's what's going on in Gaza is not in any way some kind of justified military activity against a terrorist organization, but rather a widespread genocidal and terrorist campaign against a civilian population that Israel wants to expel. All right, couple more stories on Ukraine here before we get into the Israel news. Lockheed Martin to increase production of HIMARS rocket launchers by 60%. This from Data Camp, February 20th. Lockheed Martin will increase production of HIMARS by over 60% by the end of the year, as the rocket launcher has been in high demand since the U.S. started sending it to Ukraine. The U.S. first provided HIMARS to Ukraine in June of 2022, which marked a significant escalation in U.S. support for the proxy war. HIMARS are mounted on trucks, making them easy to move and fire GPS-guided munitions. According to the Defense Post, the U.S. has delivered 39 HIMARS to Ukraine, and several European countries, including Estonia, Latvia, and Poland, have placed orders for advanced artillery systems. Lockheed Martin produced 60 HIMARS launchers in 2023, which marked a 25% increase from 2022. This year, the weapons maker aims to produce just short of 100. The Army is looking for a total of 500 HIMARS by 2028, which will include producing 100 a year. The increase in HIMARS production is just one example of how proxy war in Ukraine has been a total boon for the U.S. arms makers. Lockheed Martin is also looking to increase the production of Javelin anti-tank missiles, which are made jointly with Raytheon, the former employer of U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. The war in Ukraine revived Raytheon's Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which were out of production for 20 years. To start production, Raytheon had to call in retired engineers. And of course, this has all been just a massive influx of money. I'm sure they're charging the government as much as they possibly can for all of these weapon systems. All right, another one from Dave DeCamp here. Biden says he'll impose major sanctions on Russia over Navalny's death. President Biden on Tuesday said his administration will be announcing major sanctions on Russia over the death of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny. So a couple things about this guy. The first one is, let's start here. I'm not sure that he was an asset of the CIA or MI6. Certainly, he seems, or he definitely was, echoing the Western narrative against Russia and Putin in his latter years before he was imprisoned. Early on, he was a just pretty staunch Russian nationalist. He supported the annexation of Crimea. He is not in any way a liberal. He has certainly called for violence against Russia's Muslim minority, including calling them cockroaches, and suggests Russian people should go out in the streets and shoot them. And so he is certainly at best you could say a mixed bag, but really he's a violent and was a pretty fairly deplorable person. That being said, I think he was probably killed in Russia, not necessarily intentionally by Putin, but either from maybe medical neglect in like a Gonzalo Lira case. There's also the possibility that, him essentially taking the side of the West in the war in Ukraine, or I'm sure at least that's the way it often felt to people in Russia. And with a lot of Russians dying in Ukraine, there could have been somebody in the prison who wanted him dead just because, they feel like Navalny's, kind of his status and what he represents to the West, which is we could overthrow Putin and get a more liberal and Western leaning Russia that encourages the West to continue this proxy war in Ukraine. Right. And so I'm not saying that Navalny is responsible. I'm just saying I could see how Russian people would see it that way and why somebody might want to kill him. There's also this leaked phone call he had with a Russian intelligence officer of some kind, where he supposedly got the Russian intelligence officer to admit that they had attempted to poison Navalny's underwear. If true, if authentic, maybe that person's embarrassed and he orders a hit on this guy. So, there's a lot of things that could have happened here. I'm guessing he was not in good conditions in this Russian jail. So I find this story all very interesting. We'll see where these sanctions go. One of the directions it could go is seizing Russian money. And if the U.S. does go in that direction, they could take that money to start buying weapons. And that would really circumvent Congress not passing the aid bill to Ukraine. All right, this one from the New York Times. Hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers captured after retreat from Avdiivka. So the Times reports hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers may have been captured by advancing Russian units or disappeared during Ukraine's chaotic retreat from the eastern city of Avdiivka, according to senior Western officials and soldiers fighting for Ukraine, a devastating loss that could deal a blow to an already weakening morale. The Russian capture of the city has emerged as a significant symbol of loss for Ukrainian troops, a sign of battlefield impact of a failure of the Congress so far to approve military assistance, as dwindling supplies of artillery shells make it harder to hold the line. Now, I thought this was important because this is a really terrible propaganda line and a really big lie that is being told right now by the U.S. government. And that is, if Congress passes this aid, there's going to be an immediate boon and boost to the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And while there may be some money that can go towards some weapon systems that can help the Ukrainians somewhat, really the problems that Ukraine faces are production shortages. They need more artillery rounds, but the U.S. is either sending them to Israel or, is trying to replenish its own stockpiles and supplies. They haven't been able to send Ukraine real artillery shells for months and months and months. They've been sending them the cluster variant for a very long time. Ukraine also needs soldiers, and there's nothing, we could throw hundreds of billions of dollars at Ukraine, and certainly we could train some Ukrainian soldiers with that money, but training soldiers in a way where they're able to fight on the front lines right away takes a lot of time. It is not something that could just be solved by money. And so this idea that we're just going to pass this aid and it's like in a video game, an energy boost or something like that to the Ukrainian military, and now suddenly they have all these weapons and all these men to fight. That's just not true. That's not how this works. It's a complete lie. It's a complete lie. There's this story they keep talking about where there's a Ukrainian soldier who's sitting in the trenches of the front lines every hour checking his phone for news that the U.S. Congress passed the aid. Like somehow Congress passing that aid is going to help him. He's a dead man, but because of Washington and Kiev, because they won't negotiate a deal with Moscow. And it doesn't matter how much aid we pass. So back to the Times article here. Estimates of how many Ukrainians were captured or missing vary, and precise count may not be possible until Ukraine solidifies new defensive lines outside of the city. But two soldiers with knowledge of the retreat estimate that between 850 and 1,000 soldiers appear to have been captured or are unaccounted for. The Western officials said the range seemed accurate. Now, the only thing I maybe cross my fingers and hope here for some of those soldiers is that maybe they just went home. Why the front lines collapsed, they escaped, and they kind of just, left and decided to desert. And maybe that's the way they end up living, because taking up a frontline position somewhere else will probably just get them killed. Now, the one other thing I want to mention here is on the last show, we talked about the pull out of this city, and I noted that previously, the new commander of the Ukrainian forces had a reputation of keeping Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut for too long and was known as the Butcher because of that. And I had, kind of speculated and said, maybe in trying to better his reputation or something, he elects to withdraw from Avdiivka. But it doesn't seem like this city was a retreat because the Russians were coming. It was not in any way an organized retreat to preserve the lives of the Ukrainian soldiers. And so I don't think that was the case anymore. All right, one more story on the Ukraine situation. Pelosi suggests Trump beholden to Putin for financial reasons. And I wish I had a half hour to yell about Russiagate on this show, because so much of that narrative is rearing its ugly head once again. And I have spent so much time debunking that narrative, and I love to hate to talk about it at this point, but I have to note this. So Pelosi slams, remarking on Trump's statement on the death of Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny, Pelosi said Trump's statement was beneath the dignity of a human being and should disqualify him for running for anything, much less president of the United States. For the record, Trump compared himself to Alexei Navalny, his legal troubles in the U.S., to what Navalny suffered in Russia. Now, while there is a pretty significant difference between what Trump and Navalny went through, there are a lot of people in the Capitol on January 6th who are still in jail, still in solitary confinement. Some of them have committed suicide. One or two people, have committed suicide because of the persecution that they felt on January 6th. And many of them were far, less violent than Alexei Navalny was. So, Trump is such a narcissist. He doesn't see that it would actually be far more effective to compare Navalny to his supporters. But everything's just about him. All right, so Pelosi's statement continues. You wonder, what does Putin have on Donald Trump that he always has to be beholden to him, his buddy and vileness? What does Putin have on Donald Trump that he would have to consistently be catering to Putin, telling Putin go into these countries, NATO countries? I don't know what he has on him, but I think it's probably financial. Either something financial he has on him or something that he expects to get. And so this is just the same Russiagate stupidity that existed in 2015 and really, is a precursor for the war in Ukraine. I think it's hard to imagine that the political dynamics in the U.S. being supportive of Biden waging a $100 billion proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, distinctly a policy that that Barack Obama was unwilling to take and to follow. Without Russiagate and the hatred towards Russia that came about in the Democrat circles in this country because Hillary Clinton lost an election to Donald Trump and they were just unwilling to accept it. All right, next up here, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Netanyahu boasts that he blocked a Palestinian state for decades. And so, of course, we know it's true on this show. Connor Freeman and Scott Horton, the co-hosts of the show, Connor Freeman, have an excellent article out that everybody should read. But I think it's really important when the words come out of Netanyahu's mouth. And he said, according to the Times of Israel, everyone knows that I am the one who for decades blocked the establishment of a Palestinian state that would have endangered our existence. And this should be, a massive problem for the Americans, right? Like, this is Netanyahu is admitting that he has spent decades working against what the Americans say our goal is in Israel. And yet, it doesn't matter to Americans. It doesn't matter to the U.S. government. In fact, we're looking at sending Israel more bombs this week. He made the comments while discussing a plan to introduce legislation into the Knesset that would match a declaration made by the Israeli cabinet on Sunday that rejected international diktats related to a Palestinian state. And so it looks like Israel is going to make it official that they will never accept a Palestinian state. For some reason, I don't think it's going to impact the American support for Israel, even though the U.S. says that the reason they support Israel is to one day lead to a two-state solution and a Palestinian state. Just all lies. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Israel further limits aid into Gaza, leading to more starving children. Over the past 2 weeks, Israeli actions have severely limited aid agencies' ability to distribute aid into Gaza. The situation is particularly grim in the northern half of the strip, where aid deliveries have been halted for 3 weeks. 1 in 6 children are suffering from acute malnutrition. The Associated Press reported Tuesday entry of aid trucks into the besieged territory has sharply declined by more than half the past 2 weeks, according to UN figures. Israeli failure to ensure the safety of aid shipments is contributing to the decline in deliveries. Aid shipments into Gaza were also significantly reduced from levels before October 7th. The problem is further exacerbated by Tel Aviv's onerous inspections regime for trucks attempting to enter the strip. Restrictions on aid, including preventing life-saving medication from entering Gaza. The complex inspection regime slows the assistance into Gaza. Israeli citizens are additionally protesting near the border crossing with Gaza against aid shipments into the strip. The protesters block aid, and Israeli authorities often allow them to delay the shipments. Aid entering Gaza is often mobbed by starving and desperate Palestinians. The Israeli military targeted the Gaza police force that was escorting the aid deliveries in the strip, leading to the police ceasing the service. The combination of challenges facing agencies attempting to distribute aid into the strip has forced the UN World Food Program to halt deliveries into the northern half of Gaza. Assistance to the north has been cut off for nearly 3 weeks. An Israeli airstrike on an aid convoy caused the initial pause in shipments. People in the region are eating plants, weeds, grass, and animal feed in an attempt to survive. The children of Gaza face a dire situation that can become lethal. 90% of children under 5 face food poverty, and 70% have recently had diarrhea. The combination of starvation and diarrhea can be fatal for children. So, I mean, just absolutely horrific. And I saw today, this was actually reported by CNN, so just the morning of Wednesday, February 21st, that Israel had fired on and destroyed another aid truck inside of Gaza. Next up here, UN experts find credible reports that Palestinian women and girls were executed and raped by Israeli forces. Now, this is, I think, one of the most important stories we have to talk about. And I hate talking about it. I hated talking about the last story. I hated writing it. This is awful. And it's disgusting things that the Israeli government is doing to the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people. But so much of the Israeli narrative, so much of what Israel is doing, so much of what the U.S. government is doing to support Israel is justified on the now largely debunked premise that there was widespread rape and, there were certainly widespread crimes by Hamas against Israelis on October 7th. But the depravity of those crimes certainly hasn't matched the initial claims. But still, we have people talking about mutilating the body of Israelis, gang rape, and things like that, are not backed by evidence. And, they can't turn up claims that this actually documented it happened. And we're now, 4 months after October 7th. And so you have to really start to question whether there's no evidence because there was an amount, a significant or maybe no significant sexual violence against women on October 7th. I mean, I don't want to say none. Like, I'm sure, some women were groped and things like that by Hamas fighters or something. But that is, again, significantly different from the initial claims that were made on October 7th, and that Israel has used to justify the killing of 13,000 Palestinian children, 30,000 Palestinians overall, over 100 Palestinian journalists, 100 UN aid workers, the destruction of almost every hospital and medical facility in Gaza. All that has been, done with the force of this narrative that is now seemingly becoming untrue. However, we now have documentation that Israel is committing those same crimes that they alleged, not even proven, but alleged were committed against the Israelis on October 7th are now being committed against the Palestinian women and girls. So a UN press release explains, UN experts today expressed alarm over credible allegations of egregious human rights violations to which Palestinian women and girls continue to be subjected to in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Palestinian women and girls have reportedly been arbitrarily executed in Gaza, often together with family members, including their children, according to information received. We are shocked by reports of the deliberate targeting and extrajudicial killings of Palestinian women and children in places that they have sought refuge or while fleeing. Some of them were reportedly holding white pieces of cloth when they were killed by Israeli army or affiliated forces, the experts say. And that part of this statement is certainly true. There is absolutely no doubt that this has happened. I have witnessed dozens of these situations of women sometimes holding their children being executed by Israeli snipers. Child in one hand, white flag in the other. They are holding a child who's holding a white flag, and they are just mercilessly gunned down on the streets. The experts expressed serious concern about the arbitrary detention of hundreds of Palestinian women and girls, including human rights defenders, journalists, and humanitarian workers in Gaza and the West Bank since October 7th. Many have reportedly been subject to inhumane and degrading treatment, denied menstrual pads, food, and medicine, and severely beaten. On at least one occasion, Palestinian women detained in Gaza were allegedly kept in a cage in the rain and cold without food. And again, up until the part about the woman being kept in a cage, this is all stuff that is very well documented, that is not in dispute whatsoever. I mean, I don't see any reason to doubt the story of the women being kept in the cage. I certainly would see more evidence before I actually say Israel definitely did this, but all the other stuff is very well documented. All right, so next, we were particularly distressed by reports that Palestinian women and girls in detention have also been subject to multiple forms of sexual assault, such as being stripped naked and searched by Israeli male officers. At least 2 female detainees were reportedly raped, while others were reportedly threatened with rape and sexual violence, the experts said. They also note that the photos of female detainees in degrading circumstances were reportedly taken by the Israeli army and uploaded online. And so this is revenge porn, right? This is, I mean, it's worse than revenge porn because, you went and you forced the women to strip naked. You took photos of them and then uploaded them online. I mean, these are massive, horrific crimes being committed. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like, how you would feel in your community if some external force came in, stripped all of your women naked, took pictures of them and posted them online? I mean, I'm sure there are just absolutely unthinkable things American men would do to the people who did that to their women. All right. And then the last quote I have here from this UN statement: the experts expressed concern that an unknown number of Palestinian women and children, including girls, have reportedly gone missing after contact with the Israeli army in Gaza. There are disturbing reports of at least one female infant forcibly transferred by the Israeli army into Gaza, and of children being separated from their parents whose whereabouts remain unknown, they said. And this is, again, something that's been very well documented, that many people have been arbitrarily detained, particularly in Gaza, and nobody knows where they have ended up. All right, next up here, I have a compilation of a few statements from Avril Benoit, who is the executive director of Doctors Without Borders in the U.S. And she's commenting on a few things. The first here, she's commenting on the potential upcoming U.S.-Israeli operations in Gaza. She says, the consequences of a full-scale assault on Gaza or on Rafah are truly unimaginable, with people in makeshift shelters that can't even protect against the cold. Carrying out a military operation there would turn it into a graveyard. And then last week, she said, further on Gaza, there are now more than 1.5 million people trapped in Rafah, a town at the southernmost tip of Gaza. They have nowhere else to go. Conditions in Rafah are dire. Many families have been displaced multiple times and few have belongings. They are sheltering in flimsy and unheated tents with little access to water, sanitation, food, or health care. Tens of thousands of people continue to pour into Rafah from neighboring Khan units where fighting intensifies. The government of Israel announced that a full-scale assault on Rafah was imminent, leaving more than 1 million people in the line of fire. Our staff and patients are terrified. Rafah isn't just the last refuge for most of Gaza's population. It is the only remaining hub of healthcare services and humanitarian assistance in the Strip. More than 28,000 human beings have already been killed in Gaza. A military offensive in Rafah will kill and injure even more and destroy the only support the people they have left. Rafah is the end of the line. There is nowhere else to flee. Even if displaced people return north, they will find no homes to go back to and no supply lines to bring them food, water, medication, or any other essentials. The consequences of a full-scale assault on Rafah are truly unimaginable. We can only stand and wait for this to unfold. And then this is a statement that she made in response to the U.S. veto of a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. And I will talk about that next, by the way. So this is Benoit's statement. The United States continues to obstruct efforts by the UN Security Council to demand an immediate ceasefire and bring a meaningful humanitarian aid and desperately needed relief to the people of Gaza. The U.S. once again stands alone among its peers on the council, complicit in the extending the suffering of the Palestinian civilians. 4 months into this war, Israeli forces continue to indiscriminately attack civilian and civilian structures, impose a siege that amounts to collective punishment, force mass displacement, and deny access to vital medical care and humanitarian assistance. A ceasefire has never been more urgent. Today, more than 1.5 million people are trapped in Rafah, the southernmost point of Gaza Strip, and they are living in dire conditions, in flimsy tents with little access to water, sanitation, food, or healthcare. They have nowhere else left to go. The government of Israel has announced a full-scale assault on the area is imminent. A military offensive in Rafah will kill and injure countless people. So many of the nightmare scenarios we have warned about have already unfolded in Gaza, but an attack on Rafah would be truly unimaginable. The U.S. government has repeatedly stressed how concerned it is for civilians in Gaza, while simultaneously funding and providing diplomatic cover to Israel for war crimes characterized by extraordinary high number of civilian deaths and repeated attacks on hospitals and healthcare workers. If the U.S. and other member states truly commit to the protection of human life and upholding of humanitarian law in Gaza, they would do everything in their power to end the suffering and bring about an immediate and permanent ceasefire. All right, so let's see what the U.S. is actually doing when they have an opportunity to encourage a ceasefire. U.S. vetoes another Gaza ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council. This from Dave DeCamp, February 20th, antiwar.com. The U.S. on Tuesday voted on a resolution at the UN Security Council that called for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. It marks the third time that the U.S. has used its veto power on the Security Council to block a call for an end to the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians. The U.S. was the only member to vote against the resolution, which was introduced by Algeria. The U.K. abstained, and all other 13 members voted in favor of the measure. And remember what Biden said he was going to bring the U.S. back in line with the international community? The UK won't even vote with us on this. They only abstained. Every other country, that includes France, voted in favor of this resolution. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, slammed the Algerian effort after the vote. Proceeding with the vote today was wishful and irresponsible. And while we cannot support a resolution that would put sensitive negotiations in jeopardy, we look forward to engaging in attacks we will believe will address many of the concerns that we all share, which is, I mean, just an absolutely disgusting thing to say. To say that calling for a ceasefire is counterproductive and irresponsible is just, it's propaganda. I get it. That's what she's doing. That's what she's paid to do. But to be able to espouse propaganda like that, as the number of Palestinian children is well over 10,000 dead, is just unthinkable. When the number of starving Palestinian children is one that sits, to continue to act like this it's really unthinkable. And now, I'm sure this was more of a Freudian slip or poorly phrased statement that Thomas Greenfield made, but she additionally said that the U.S. is looking for a final solution on the ground in Gaza, which, if they end up just slaughtering all 1.5 million or a large portion of the 1.5 million Palestinians that are sheltering in Rafah, Thomas Greenfield's statements there will certainly be looked at with a lot of concern, that she was just saying that, yeah, Israel is going to conduct, a final solution, aka a massacre and a genocide, just the slaughter of the Palestinian people. So the Middle East Eye reports the International Court of Justice in The Hague has begun hearing submissions on Monday on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. So this is separate from the case brought by South Africa, which I think just the way the ICJ works seems to be a stronger case to me, although, this has a lot of backing. The highest court will hear from 52 countries and 3 international organizations on the legal consequences of Israel's decade-long occupation. The hearings will contribute to an advisory opinion, an ICJ instrument that has a non-binding force but carries significant legal and moral authority. The number of states participating in the oral proceedings is the highest in any case since the ICJ was established in 1945. Israel has been occupying what is recognized under international law as Palestinian land since the 1967 war. East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza all fall into this category, and separate legal systems construct the settlement and acts of violence meted out against Palestinian residents are all key factors to be considered at the hearing. The case goes back to December of 2022 when the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the ICJ to give an Israel advisory opinion on Israel's 57-year occupation of Palestinian territories. And one of the things that Israel is doing in Gaza as a part of its system of oppression is constructing a road to cut Gaza Strip into two. I have some questions as to why this is going on, but we will, I'm sure, see at some point soon. So Israel's demolishing buildings to build a road through central Gaza that will cut the strip in two, demonstrating Israel's long-term plans to occupy the territory. Israel's Channel 14 report the road, which is being built as the Nezarium Corridor, the new road, known as Highway 749, will separate Gaza City from the rest of the strip. Israel is creating a 1-kilometer buffer zone to the north and south of the road, similar to the zone it's creating along the entire Israel-Gaza border, according to the New Arab. Among the structures likely to be demolished to build the road is the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, which was shut down in November due to an Israeli siege that cut off fuel. And now, I believe that was the hospital that provided cancer treatment in Gaza. But I think, what this is really going to do is it's going to make it impossible for any Palestinian to return to North Gaza. What they call a buffer zone, just basically, I guess, a free fire zone. If you're a Palestinian, you enter that 1-kilometer zone to the north and south of the road. That means the Israeli forces are going to gun you down and murder you. So this is just a huge swath of Gaza that will be occupied by Israel, and maybe they'll construct more and more of these until the Palestinians just have absolutely nowhere they could safely travel in Gaza, and that'll be the way that Israel conducts this ethnic cleansing. So next up here is Israel limits the number of Palestinians that can attend Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. We talked about this on the last show, and it seems like the Israeli plans have changed some. So the Associated Press reports Israel will cap the number of Muslim citizens who can take part in peak prayers at Jerusalem's Aqsa Mosque during the upcoming Ramadan holy month that starts in March. This was driven by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister. He wanted to prevent all Palestinians under the age of 70 from visiting the mosque. So it seems that they kind of changed. They want to only allow 40 to 50,000 Palestinians to have access to the mosque during Ramadan. And I'm not sure what the normal number of visitors are and how restrictive this is. Maybe 40 to 50,000 is just the number of elderly Palestinians that would normally request access to the Aqsa Mosque. And so this is a way of making it not sound so restrictive, or, maybe this is a little bit less, restricted than the initial plan. Either way, this is likely going to significantly exacerbate tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians, locking down the one of the holiest places in Islam during the holy month. All right, so 2 stories on Yemen here to wrap up the show today. Houthis say they shot down U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone. The Yemen's Houthis say Monday that their forces downed a MQ-9 Reaper drone that was flying over Yemen. U.S. officials have acknowledged that the drone crashed and say they're investigating the cause. Yemeni air defenses were able to shoot down the American MQ-9 with a suitable missile while it was carrying out hostile missions against our country on behalf of the Zionist entity, Houthi spokesperson told the New York Times. Yemeni armed forces will not hesitate to take more military measures and conduct more qualitative operations against all targets in defense of the beloved Yemen. The spokesperson continued, the incident marks the second time a U.S. Reaper drone was downed by the Houthis over Yemen since November. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, also said on Monday that they struck a British-owned cargo ship in the Gulf of Aden, which was confirmed by U.S. Central Command. And additionally, it looks like Yemen, the U.S. has confirmed that the Houthis struck 2 U.S.-owned cargo ships. So the U.S. military on Tuesday said that the Houthis struck 2 U.S.-owned cargo ships a day earlier, confirming a statement made by the Yemeni group on the attacks. U.S. Central Command said the Houthis fired 2 missiles at Sea Champion, a Greek-flagged U.S.-owned grain carrier, causing minor damage. The command said the ship continued to its destination, which was Aden, the southern port city in Yemen. The Houthis also fired a drone at the Navis Fontuna, a Marshall Islands-fled U.S.-owned bulk carrier. The attack also caused minor damage, and the command vessel was able to continue the voyage to Italy. CENTCOM claimed that it struck the surface-to-air launcher in Yemen and a drone that was preparing to launch. The U.S. has been bombing Yemen almost every day, but the strikes have done nothing to deter the Houthis. And in fact, what we've seen over the past couple days, downing the Reaper drones, hitting the ships, it seems that the Yemeni forces are only getting better. You know, I've joked on the show in the past that I think if aliens invaded the Earth, the Houthis would have photon missiles and hyperdrives within a couple of months. And, you know, of course, that's a joke, but it does seem like on the military spectrum of things, the Houthis are able to often and very quickly rise to the occasion, develop new military technologies, counters, and wage pretty effective warfare against far more equipped and better funded opponents, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, like Ali Abdullah Saleh, or like the US and the UK, as we're now seeing. So, yeah, very, very crazy to see the war in Yemen develop in this way. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. We'll be back with more later in the week. Oh, and then today I will be on Alan Mosley's show. I will be talking about the Assange stuff. So we recorded that last night. I think it did a pretty good job talking Assange. So definitely check that out. And then I was on Judge Napolitano's show on Monday. So I'll put that back out on Twitter so everybody can see it. Thank you all so much. Again, back with more shows later in the week.